The unexpected seat, the evening was warm, but inside the grand hall the air felt heavy with silence and expectation. Hundreds of eyes looked forward, every breath waiting for the Prime Minister to enter. The hall was a sea of polished wood, red carpets and golden chandeliers that reflected light like drops of fire. This was not an ordinary gathering. It was one of those rare evenings when leaders, thinkers, and dreamers of the nation came together, and the presence of one man would change everything. His name was Sundar Pichai, and though he carried himself like any other guest, everyone knew he was not like anyone else in the room. He had left India years ago, chasing a dream across oceans, and now he had returned with a story so powerful that even the walls seemed to lean closer to hear it. The Prime Minister, Modi ji, entered with calm strength, his steps slow yet certain, the kind of walk that spoke of responsibility carried for millions. The hall rose in respect, hands came together in greeting, and for a moment the air vibrated with unity. Sundar stood among the crowd, his tall frame slightly bent forward as if trying to make himself smaller, his eyes lowered not from fear, but from humility. He was a man who had learned that the weight of greatness is best carried with gentleness. Then, it happened. The moment that would shock the nation and set the stage for everything to follow. Modi ji looked across the hall, scanning faces, and his eyes stopped on Sundar. In that instant, there was no mistaking the connection. The leader of the nation lifted his hand, pointed directly at Sundar, and with a voice steady yet warm invited him to come forward and sit beside him. The room gasped. Ministers, industrialists, scholars, all turned their heads. This was not written in the program, not rehearsed, not expected. The Prime Minister had broken protocol, and for Sundar, a man who had grown used to staying behind the curtain of global technology, this invitation was both an honor and a storm. Sundar's heart pounded. His mind raced back through years of struggle, memories flashing like lightning. The small home in Chennai where he grew up, the crowded streets filled with the smell of jasmine and dust, the nights when electricity cut off and his family studied, by candlelight. The hope in his mother's eyes when he first spoke of leaving for America. The doubt in his father's quiet face when expenses seemed impossible. He had walked through 1,000 doors that threatened to close, and now here he was, asked to sit at the very front, in a place no one expected him to be. As he walked forward, each step heavier than the last, the whispers began. Some voices carried admiration, others envy, a few even disbelief. One man muttered that success in Silicon Valley was one thing, but respect in the corridors of Delhi was another. Another voice said that Sundar was too simple, too soft-spoken to carry such an weight. Sundar heard nothing clearly, only the sound of his own heartbeat echoing against the polished marble floor. When he reached the front, Modi ji stood and offered his hand. The hall froze again, and cameras flashed like tiny explosions of light. Sundar bowed slightly, accepted the hand, and sat down in the empty chair beside the Prime Minister. It was a chair reserved for someone else, someone with influence and status. But now it belonged to a man who had once carried his notebooks in a torn bag through the lanes of Chennai. And yet, even as he sat, Sundar felt a storm rising inside him. He was not comfortable. The weight of attention was a burden he had never asked for. His humility clashed with the honor being shown, and deep inside he wondered whether he deserved it at all. The speeches began, words of progress and dreams for the nation, but Sundar could not focus. He saw the faces in the crowd, some filled with respect, others questioning his place. He remembered his journey, every step paved not with glory but with resilience. He remembered the long nights at Stanford, when he could not afford textbooks and had to borrow from friends. He remembered eating the same cheap meal every day, not because he liked it, but because that was all he could afford. He remembered moments of failure when projects collapsed and professors doubted his ideas. Yet he had never given up, and that persistence had carried him to the head of one of the most powerful companies in the world. As the evening continued, the storm inside Sundar grew stronger. He wanted to speak, to share something real, something that could reach beyond the glitter of the hall and into the hearts of ordinary people watching from afar. He wanted to say that greatness is not about titles or seats beside leaders, but about the strength to keep moving when life tries to stop you. But before he could gather his thoughts, Modiji leaned toward him and whispered words that only Sundar could hear. "Your journey is not only your own," the Prime Minister said, softly. "Tonight you carry the story of millions of young Indians who believe they are too small, too poor, or too ordinary to dream. Show them what is possible." Those words struck Sundar like lightning. He looked again at the hall, but now he no longer saw the chandeliers or the golden walls. He saw his old classmates who never had the chance to study abroad. He saw the children in his neighborhood who shared one book among 5 friends. He saw the tired face of his mother who had given up her own dreams so he could chase his. He realized that the seat beside the Prime Minister was not for him alone. It was for every person who had ever wondered if they mattered. The hall erupted in applause as another speaker finished, but Sundar barely noticed. He was lost in thought, the whisper of Modi Ji still ringing in his ears. He felt a rising fire, not of pride, but of responsibility. He knew he could not remain silent much longer. Then, as if fate wanted to test him, an unexpected voice rose from the crowd. It was an older businessman, respected and known for his bluntness. He stood without invitation, his voice sharp and direct. "With all due respect, Prime Minister," he said, "what has this man done for India? He left. He built his life elsewhere. And now we celebrate him as if he carried this nation on his shoulders. Is this the message we wish to give our youth?" The hall gasped again, but this time the silence cut deeper. Eyes turned to Sundar, waiting for his reaction. Anger, shame, or retreat. What would he choose? His hands trembled under the table, and for a long moment he said nothing. Inside, memories of struggle clashed with the sting of the words. The accusation was sharp, and though unfair, it touched a truth he often wrestled with. Had he abandoned his homeland, or had he carried it within him all along? The Prime Minister's face tightened, but he did not speak. It was Sundar's moment to answer, and the weight of millions seemed to press upon his chest. The camera zoomed closer, the air thick with expectation, and the world waited to hear the voice of a man who had been silent for too long. And then Sundar finally lifted his head, his eyes steady, his voice calm, yet filled with quiet strength. What he said next would not only silence the room, but it would spark a fire across the nation, a fire of humility, resilience, and hope. The answer that shook the hall. The silence was heavy, almost unbearable, like a storm waiting to break. Sundar sat still for a moment, his fingers pressed together, his breath deep and steady, his mind running through the journey of his life as if searching for the right piece of truth to offer. The businessman's words echoed in his ears, harsh and sharp, and though they carried doubt, Sundar knew they represented a question many in the hall quietly carried in their hearts. Had he left his country behind to chase his own dreams, or had he somehow carried a piece of India wherever he went? He looked out at the crowd, faces filled with expectation. Some eyes were stern, others sympathetic, but most simply wanted to know if the man sitting beside the Prime Minister truly deserved the honor. Sundar inhaled slowly, remembering his father's voice telling him that silence was not weakness, but sometimes silence was a greater answer than words. Yet tonight, silence would not be enough. He had to speak. "I was born in a small home in Chennai," Sundar began, his voice calm but strong, "in a family where every decision about money mattered. When I was a boy, a single phone was installed in our house, and neighbors would come to use it because they did not have one. I would watch them wait, sometimes for hours, just to speak a few words to a loved one. That was the moment I first dreamed about technology, not as machines, not as wealth, but as a way to make life simpler for ordinary people." The hall grew quiet. Sundar's words were not defensive, not angry. They were gentle, yet powerful, carrying the weight of memory and truth. "When I left India to study abroad," he continued, "I carried those memories with me. Every time I saw new technology, every time I worked on projects, I thought of the people back home. I thought of how a simple tool could save a farmer hours of labor, or how one message could bring comfort to a family separated by distance. Yes, I worked in another land, but every step I took was guided by the needs of the land I came from. I never left India behind. I carried India in my heart, in my work, and in my dreams." The words rolled across the hall like waves, breaking through the walls of doubt. Sundar did not raise his voice, but the truth in his tone pierced deeper than any shout could. Ministers leaned forward, journalists scribbled furiously, and young students in the back felt their hearts stir with recognition. They too carried dreams of leaving home, and they too feared being judged as deserters. Sundar had given their conflict a voice, but Sundar was not finished. He turned toward the businessman who had raised the question, his eyes steady, his face calm. "You ask what I have done for India," he said softly, "and I will tell you, I have carried the hope of millions into rooms where no one else from our land was present. I have spoken about India not as a market, but as a heartbeat. I have built teams that include voices from here, giving them the chance to shape the world. I have opened doors for young Indians to dream bigger than I ever could. No, I may not have built factories on our soil, but I have carried our story into every boardroom, every decision, every corner of the world I entered. And that, I believe, is also a way of serving one's country." A hush fell over the hall. Even the businessman, who moments ago stood tall with challenge, lowered his gaze slightly. His lips pressed tight but without words to reply. The Prime Minister smiled faintly, not with triumph but with the satisfaction of seeing humility rise above arrogance. The crowd erupted into applause, but Sundar did not smile. Instead, he bowed his head slightly, as if reminding himself that applause was fleeting but truth was eternal. Then, just as the hall began to settle, Sundar's words took a turn that no one expected. "But I must also confess," he said, his voice now heavy, "that I often wonder if I have done enough. I ask myself if I should have stayed here, working closer to the soil that raised me. I wonder if the children who walk the same streets I once walked still struggle with the same problems I once faced. My success has been great, but the question remains, what more should I do and what more can I give?" The applause stopped. The hall froze again, stunned by his honesty. This was not the voice of a man defending himself. This was the voice of a man bearing his soul before a nation. The vulnerability in his words cut deeper than any polished speech could. A young student in the back wiped tears from her eyes. A minister who had once dismissed Sundar as irrelevant now shifted uncomfortably in his chair. The Prime Minister leaned back, watching closely, as if weighing the weight of those words against the expectations of an entire country. And then, without warning, a hand rose in the audience. It was a woman, middle-aged, her sari plain, her eyes tired but shining. She was not on the guest list of the evening. She was a teacher from a rural school, invited at the last minute to represent the ordinary citizen. Her voice trembled as she spoke, but it carried a strength born from years of shaping young minds. "Sundar," she said softly, "if you truly wonder what more you can do, then listen to the children. They need hope more than technology. They need someone to tell them that even if they are born in small homes, they too can sit where you sit today." The hall turned toward her, surprised that she dared to speak. Sundar's eyes filled with emotion. In her words he heard the echo of his own mother, the sacrifices, the dreams, the silent prayers of every parent who wished for a better future for their child. He stood slowly, turned toward the teacher, and bowed his head in respect. "You are right," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "And perhaps that is the greatest responsibility I carry, not to build only products, but to build faith, to show the next generation that they are not limited by the walls around them." The teacher's eyes glistened with tears, and the hall fell silent once more. Sundar had not only answered the question, he had shifted the very meaning of the evening. And yet, even as the crowd began to rise in applause again, even as the Prime Minister's face lit with quiet pride, something stirred in the back of the hall. A figure moved against the tide of admiration, slipping quietly out of the room unnoticed by most. This figure carried a plan, a shadow against the light that Sundar had just cast. A plan that, if revealed, would test Sundar's humility, resilience, and kindness in ways he had never imagined. Shadows behind the applause. The applause thundered through the hall, echoing against the marble walls and climbing into the glittering chandeliers above. People rose to their feet, clapping with passion, their hands striking together as if to confirm that they had just witnessed something unforgettable. Cameras flashed in bursts of light, capturing the image of Sundar standing with quiet dignity, his head slightly bowed, his eyes softened not by pride but by reflection. He had not raised his voice, yet he had spoken with a strength that cut deeper than iron. And yet, far from the applause, down the dim corridor leading out of the hall, a figure walked swiftly, each step purposeful and heavy. His face was half hidden, under the shadow of his scarf, his eyes burning with something darker than admiration. No one noticed his departure, for all eyes were fixed on the stage, but his absence carried weight, like a missing note in a song that leaves the melody incomplete. Back inside, Sundar sat once more beside the Prime Minister, but his heart was not at rest. His words had silenced doubt, his honesty had stirred admiration, and yet there was a lingering unease in his chest. He could not explain it, only feel it. A quiet sense that the night was far from over, that something unseen had shifted. The Prime Minister leaned closer again, speaking in a voice too soft for others to hear. "You have answered well, Sundar," he said, "but words alone do not calm every storm. Some storms begin outside these walls." Sundar nodded slowly, though the meaning was unclear. He looked around the hall, the faces glowing with admiration, the journalist scribbling with renewed energy, the teacher still wiping her tears, and yet he felt the absence of something, or someone, he could not name. Then came the dinner. Long tables were arranged, heavy with silver plates and shining glasses, dishes carrying flavors from every corner of India. Leaders and guests moved toward them, their conversations a mix of praise, politics, and plans for the future. Sundar walked among them politely, speaking with grace, offering smiles, bowing his head in thanks when someone admired his journey. But even here, with the fragrance of spices filling the air and laughter rising in waves, his mind wandered back to the weight of the teacher's words. He thought of the children in dusty classrooms, their notebooks thin, their pencils worn to stubs, their dreams fragile like paper in the rain. He remembered himself as a boy, sitting at a wooden desk with cracks along its surface, drawing lines with borrowed pens and imagining a world he had never seen. How many children still sat in such rooms tonight, he wondered, believing they were too small to matter. The applause in the hall was grand, but the silence in those classrooms was greater. While Sundar was lost in thought, the mysterious figure had slipped out into the streets of Delhi. The night was cool, the lamps casting golden pools of light onto the narrow roads. The figure's steps were steady, but his mind raced. He carried a folder under his arm, thin yet dangerous, filled with words that could ignite suspicion and stir division. For him, Sundar was not a symbol of hope. He was a symbol of betrayal, a man who had left the soil of India and returned only when the world had crowned him with power. The figure believed that Sundar's humility was a mask, that his words were crafted illusions meant to win hearts, but hide truths. And he had decided that tonight, the mask must be torn away. Back at the dinner, a group of young entrepreneurs gathered around Sundar, eager to hear his advice. One of them, barely in his 20s, asked nervously, "Sir, how did you keep going when everything seemed impossible? Sometimes I feel like giving up." Sundar looked into the young man's eyes and saw himself reflected in that question. He smiled gently. "I kept going," he said, "because I remembered why I started. The journey is never about how fast you reach success. It is about whether you have the patience to walk when the road is steep and the courage to rise when you fall. Do not fear failure. Fear the day you stop trying." The group listened in silence, their faces brightening as if lit by an unseen flame. For them, Sundar's words were not lessons from a distant world, but a hand reaching into their present struggles, reminding them that persistence itself was a kind of victory. And yet, while this light spread in the hall, the shadow outside deepened. The figure entered a small office where a few others waited, their faces tense, their voices low. He opened the folder and spread its contents across the table. Inside were old reports, twisted stories, fragments of truth wrapped in layers of suspicion. "We will show them," he whispered, "that Sundar's loyalty is not to India, but to power. Tomorrow the nation will question his place beside the Prime Minister." The others nodded, though unease flickered in their eyes. They knew the risk of opposing both Sundar and the leader of the nation. But the fire of doubt is easy to spread when fueled by envy. They prepared their plan, unaware that their whispers would soon reach ears they never intended. Inside the hall, the night wore on. Sundar finally stepped out for a breath of fresh air, leaving behind the noise of conversation and the glitter of the chandeliers. Outside, the sky stretched wide and endless, stars scattered like sparks across the dark canvas. He looked up at them and felt the same wonder he had felt as a boy, lying on the roof of his small home, dreaming of worlds beyond his own. Yet tonight, those stars felt heavier, as if carrying the weight of a nation's expectations. As he stood in silence, the teacher approached him once more, her footsteps soft on the stone floor. She carried no airs, no hesitation. "You spoke well tonight," she said, her voice warm. "But speaking is only the beginning. Many will cheer for you, Sundar, but some will try to break you. Are you ready for that?" Sundar turned toward her, her words striking the unease he had been carrying. He did not answer immediately. Instead, he let the question settle into him, heavy and real. He had faced challenges in classrooms and companies in the global arena, but the challenges ahead were different. They were not about building products, but about protecting trust. "I don't know if I am ready," he admitted finally. "But I know that if I run from it, I will betray the very children who look at me as proof that dreams are possible. So I will stand, even if it costs me everything." The teacher nodded, her eyes filled with quiet respect. "Then the storm will come," she said. "But perhaps it is through storms that we discover who we really are." And as she spoke, far across the city, the mysterious figure sealed an envelope filled with his twisted reports, preparing to release them at dawn. The storm she warned of was already gathering, its winds sharpening, its clouds darkening. Sundar did not yet know it, but the applause of the evening was only the calm before the fiercest test of his life. The storm breaks dawn came quietly over Delhi, painting the city in shades of pale orange and soft gold. The streets stirred to life, vendors lifting the shutters of their stalls, children hurrying to school with heavy bags on their shoulders, office workers weaving through the early traffic. On the surface, it was another ordinary day, but beneath the hum of routine, whispers were beginning to spread, whispers planted by careful hands, whispers that carried weight like stones thrown into still water. The envelope had done its work. The contents, twisted reports, half-truths disguised as facts and suspicions painted as certainty, had reached eager journalists hungry for stories that could ignite debate. Headlines appeared within hours, their words sharp and biting. Did Sundar forget India? Whose side does he really serve? Success abroad? Silence at home? The question spread across newspapers, television channels, and most of all, the glowing screens of millions of phones. By noon, the city buzzed with arguments. Some defended Sundar fiercely, saying his work had brought pride to the nation, that his journey itself was proof of India's strength. Others shook their heads, convinced that he had abandoned his people, that his return was nothing more than a performance. Social media burned with words, some full of admiration, others filled with anger. In tea stalls, buses, and crowded offices, his name was spoken more than any minister's. Sundar had become not just a man, but a question. What does it mean to belong? Inside his hotel room, Sundar sat at the edge of the bed, the curtains drawn against the light. The television flickered before him, voices debating his life as if he were no more than a topic for entertainment. His face, captured in still images, flashed again and again, the handshake with the Prime Minister, the humble bow, the thoughtful gaze, all now colored with doubt. He turned the television off, but the silence was no kinder. Doubt has a way of echoing even when the noise is gone. His phone buzzed endlessly with messages. Some were words of support from colleagues abroad, friends telling him to stay strong. Others were questions from journalists demanding answers. And then there were messages that carried a harsher tone. Strangers questioning his loyalty, his choices, his heart. Sundar read them not with anger, but with a quiet ache. because hidden within the sharpest words was the same question that lived inside him. Had he truly done enough for his homeland? That evening, the Prime Minister called him to the residence. Sundar arrived quietly, his car slipping past security gates, his heart heavier with each passing minute. Modiji greeted him with a calm expression, though the lines on his face carried the burden of the day's storm. "You have stirred hearts," the Prime Minister said, his voice measured. "But you have also awakened doubts. People are asking if you stand with them or above them. I know your truth, Sundar, but truth must not only be lived, it must also be seen." Sundar listened, his eyes lowered, his hands folded loosely in front of him. He understood the meaning behind those words. The storm outside could not be silenced by private conviction. It demanded public courage. "What should I do?" Sundar asked softly. "You must face them," Modiji replied. "Not in boardrooms or halls filled with chandeliers. Face them in the places where doubt grows fastest, among ordinary people. Show them who you are, not with speeches, but with steps they can walk beside." The next day, Sundar began his journey, not through glittering events, but through the quiet corners of the country. He visited schools where chalk dust hung in the air like mist, children sitting cross-legged on the floor, their eyes wide with wonder when they saw him. He knelt down to speak with them, asking what they dreamed of becoming, telling them gently that no dream was too small. He walked through crowded markets, shaking hands with vendors, listening to their worries about rising costs, about children who wanted education but could not afford it. He did not come with promises of wealth or power. He came with presence, and sometimes presence itself is a kind of healing. But the storm followed him. In every town, voices still rose with suspicion. One man shouted that Sundar was only there because the Prime Minister had given him a seat, not because he truly cared. Another accused him of being a symbol of escape, proof that success was possible only by leaving India behind. Sundar did not argue. He listened, and though each word cut, he carried them with the same patience with which he had once carried rejection letters in his youth. Late at night, in the small guest house where he stayed, Sundar sat by the window, looking out at the quiet streets. He thought of his wife and children far away, of the comforts he had left behind, of the easier choice he could have made by remaining silent. And yet, something inside him whispered that this was the path he was meant to walk. Greatness was never about comfort. It was about carrying the weight of misunderstanding without letting it crush your spirit. As the days passed, the mysterious figure watched from a distance. His plan had succeeded in igniting suspicion, but he was not satisfied. He wanted Sundar broken, his humility twisted into weakness, his kindness turned against him. He whispered into new ears, feeding envy among leaders who had once admired Sundar, convincing them that his presence was a threat to their own standing. One evening, after Sundar spoke quietly to a group of students about resilience, a journalist approached him with a question sharp as a blade. "Sir, if you love this country so much, why did you not stay and build your future here? Why did you choose to grow abroad, only to return when it was easy?" The crowd fell silent, waiting for his response. Sundar felt the weight of the question press against his chest, heavier than any he had faced before. It was not the anger of one man, but the doubt of millions, shaped into a single sentence. He closed his eyes for a moment, searching for the words that could carry both truth and hope. And when he opened them again, his voice was calm, but the emotion beneath it was unshakable. "I left," he said slowly, "because sometimes we must leave in order to learn how to return. I went out into the world to gain knowledge, to see what was possible, and to bring that vision back. Leaving was not abandoning, it was preparing. And if my journey can open even one door for the children who sit in classrooms without light, then it was never for myself alone, it was for them." The crowd listened in silence, the air heavy with the power of his words. And yet somewhere in the shadows beyond their hearing, the figure smiled, for he knew the storm was not finished. The real test had not even begun. Betrayal. In the shadows, the days that followed were heavy with tension. Sundar continued his quiet journey through schools, markets, and villages, meeting people not with grand speeches but with patient listening. He bent down to speak with children, shook the calloused hands of workers, and sat cross-legged on dusty floors with elders who spoke of years gone by. Each step seemed to win him new hearts, but for every soul who admired him, another whispered doubt, their suspicion fed by unseen hands. The mysterious figure moved swiftly in the background, spreading his poison with precision. Whispers became rumors. Rumors became stories, and stories hardened into beliefs. Leaders who once admired Sundar began to wonder if his presence might overshadow their own. Journalists began to twist his words, framing humility as weakness, honesty as confession, kindness as calculated performance. It was not enough to question his past. Now they aimed to break his present. The strike came late one evening, when Sundar was scheduled to speak at a gathering of young engineers in Delhi. The hall was crowded, filled with faces glowing with anticipation. But before he could step onto the stage, an article exploded across every screen, an article crafted by the mysterious figure's hand. It accused Sundar of betrayal, of secretly prioritizing foreign interests, of using India's name only when convenient. The evidence was manufactured but convincing. Old documents taken out of context, conversations twisted to suggest disloyalty, anonymous voices claiming betrayal. Within minutes, the hall buzzed with murmurs. Some looked at Sundar with confusion, others with disappointment, a few even with anger. The words had struck deep, and suddenly his seat beside the Prime Minister seemed not an honor but a scandal. Sundar stood backstage holding the speech he had written, but the paper now felt meaningless. His team urged him to deny everything, to defend himself with loud declarations, but Sundar's heart resisted. He knew that shouting in anger would only add fuel to the fire, yet silence too would be twisted into guilt. He stood trapped between two paths, the noise of doubt pressing against his chest like a weight he could not shake. Finally, he stepped onto the stage. The room fell silent, all eyes fixed on him, the air thick with suspicion. Sundar did not hold the paper. Instead, he let it fall to the ground and placed both hands on the podium. His gaze steady, his voice calm, though his heart pounded inside him. "I have heard what is being said," he began. "I have read the words that claim I do not belong to this land, that I carry loyalty only for power. I will not argue with anger because anger divides more than it heals. I will not hide behind silence because silence is not what the youth of this country need. Instead, I will tell you my truth." He spoke of his journey again, but this time not as a story of success. He spoke of failure, the exams he did not pass, the projects that collapsed, the doubts that nearly broke him. He spoke of the loneliness of being far from home, eating the same meal for months because money was short, calling his family only when he could afford it. He told them that every struggle had carried the face of India within it, that even when he built technology for the world, he carried the image of the small classrooms, the dusty streets, the families waiting by shared telephones. "Loyalty is not measured by where you live," Sundar said, his voice heavy with emotion. "It is measured by what you carry in your heart, and my heart has never stopped beating for this country." The hall erupted into applause, but even applause could not drown the storm outside. By the next morning, the article had spread beyond the borders of India. International news outlets questioned Sundar's image. Investors whispered concerns. Colleagues abroad asked uneasy questions. His reputation, built over decades, now trembled under the weight of shadows. The mysterious figure watched with satisfaction, but satisfaction soon turned to frustration. Sundar had not broken. He had bent, he had ached, but he still stood. Worse, his words of humility were winning sympathy among the very people the figure sought to turn against him. The figure realized he would need to strike, not at Sundar's work, but at Sundar's soul. And so came the betrayal. One evening, Sundar sat in a quiet room, writing letters of encouragement to students who had written to him after his speeches. The letters were simple, reminders to stay patient, to believe in themselves, to never mistake failure for the end of the road. As he wrote, his phone buzzed. It was a trusted colleague, someone who had walked beside him in his global journey. But the message on the screen made Sundar's hand tremble. The colleague had leaked private conversations to the press, words taken out of context to suggest arrogance, ambition, and disdain for his homeland. Sundar stared at the screen, his chest tightening. Betrayal from outside he could endure, but betrayal from within cut deeper than any wound. The headline spread quickly. Sundar's private words reveal the truth. Humility on stage, arrogance in secret. People who had once applauded now wondered if his kindness was only performance. The mysterious figure's plan had found its sharpest weapon, not suspicion from strangers but betrayal from a friend. That night Sundar did not sleep. He sat by the window, the lights of the city flickering below, his thoughts heavy. He felt the loneliness of being doubted by those he trusted, the ache of being judged by words twisted beyond recognition. He asked himself again and again if his journey had been worth it, if his resilience had been nothing more than stubbornness, if his kindness had been too fragile for the world of power. But as the night stretched on, he remembered the teacher's words, the faces of children who had listened with hope, the quiet respect in the eyes of strangers who believed in him. He realized that resilience was not about never being betrayed. It was about choosing not to let betrayal define you. Kindness was not about being understood. It was about giving even when the world misunderstood you. As dawn broke, Sundar rose from his chair, exhausted but determined. He knew the storm was still rising, that the figure behind it was not finished. But he also knew that he could not retreat. The nation did not need a perfect hero. It needed someone willing to stand even when standing hurt. And so he prepared for what would come next. A confrontation not only with his accusers, but with the very shadow that had followed him from the beginning. The light through the storm, the morning air in Delhi was heavy, as if the sky itself carried the weight of the storm that had gathered over Sundar's life. Every newspaper headline, every television debate, every whisper on the street seemed to revolve around his name. Some spoke of him as a man of vision and humility. Others painted him as a symbol of betrayal. Truth and lies had become so entangled that few could tell them apart. The storm had reached its fiercest point, and Sundar knew the time had come to step directly into it. That day, a public forum had been arranged, one broadcast across the nation, where Sundar would face his accusers, openly. Ministers, journalists, students, workers, and ordinary citizens filled the hall, their faces tense with expectation. Cameras pointed toward the stage, their red lights glowing like watchful eyes. In the front rows sat those who doubted him most, their folders thick with papers meant to trap him, their voices sharpened like blades. Somewhere in the crowd, unseen but present, the mysterious figure waited, ready to deliver the final strike. Sundar walked onto the stage slowly, his steps measured, his face calm, though his heart carried a storm of its own. He stood at the podium, not with the armor of anger, but with the quiet strength of someone who had already endured pain and betrayal. For a moment, he looked out at the sea of faces, at the mixture of suspicion and hope, and then he spoke. "I stand before you not as a perfect man," he began, his voice steady but soft, "but as a son of this country, shaped by its soil, its struggles and its dreams. I know doubts have been raised, and I do not blame you for them. Trust is not given freely. It must be earned again and again. Today I do not ask you to believe me because of where I sit or what title I carry. I ask you to listen, not with suspicion, but with the same openness with which I listen to you." He paused, letting the words sink into the silence. The hall leaned forward, the cameras capturing every line of his face. Sundar continued, weaving his life into his truth. He spoke of the small home in Chennai, of the candlelight nights when electricity failed, of his father's sacrifices and his mother's quiet strength. He spoke of failure, loneliness, and hunger, not as complaints, but as reminders that greatness grows not from comfort but from resilience. Then he turned to the accusations. "They say I left this country behind," he said, his eyes steady. "But leaving is not the same as forgetting. Every step I took abroad, I carried India with me. Every idea I worked on, every decision I made, was guided by the thought of how it could touch lives back home. I may have walked on foreign soil, but my heart never left this land. The room stirred, but the accusers pressed forward. One rose with papers in hand, shouting about the leaked conversations, about the supposed arrogance and disloyalty in Sundar's private words. The mysterious figure's plan reached its sharpest moment. The hall grew restless, whispers rising like waves, the air heavy with doubt. Sundar did not flinch. He looked at the accuser, then at the crowd, and spoke with a calm that silenced even the loudest whispers. "Yes," he said, "those words were mine. But words spoken in moments of frustration do not define a life. If we are judged only by the fragments of our weakness, then none of us can stand without guilt. I am not here to show you perfection. I am here to show you persistence. I have stumbled, I have failed, I have doubted, but I have never stopped believing in the people of this nation." The hall quieted, the accuser lowering his papers slowly. The mysterious figure hidden in the back clenched his fists. His plan had relied on Sundar breaking under the weight of betrayal, but instead Sundar's honesty had turned weakness into strength. Then something unexpected happened. The teacher, the same woman who had spoken in the grand hall days before, stood up once more. Her voice trembled with emotion, but it carried the power of truth. "I believe him," she said, her eyes glistening. "Not because he is perfect, but because he dares to be honest. Our children need not heroes without flaws. They need examples of courage, of humility, of kindness. And today, I see that in him." Her words rippled through the hall like a wave, breaking down walls of doubt. Students rose to their feet, clapping. Workers in the back shouted in support. Ministers shifted uncomfortably, realizing that the tide of public feeling was turning. The applause grew, not forced, but rising from the hearts of those who had come seeking truth.